You told someone your goal. That was the moment it started dying. Not because they said the wrong thing. Not because they were unsupportive or skeptical or secretly hoping you'd fail. It started dying because your brain, ancient, efficient, completely indifferent to your ambitions, decided that the conversation counted as progress. You got the social signal. You received the approval. Somewhere in the reward circuitry that kept your ancestors alive, something registered. Mission partially complete. And just like that, the urgency leaked out. Most people never make this connection. They think talking about goals is part of achieving them. A warm-up, a commitment device, a way of making it real. What they don't realize is that making it socially real and making it actually real require the same psychological fuel, and there's only so much of it. This book is about the people who figured that out. Not the loudest people in the room. Not the ones with the most detailed plans or the most inspirational posts or the most articulate vision of where they're headed. The ones who figured it out are usually the ones you didn't see coming. They were quiet for a long time. Then they showed you what they'd been doing. That's not a personality type. It's a skill. It's learnable. And it starts with understanding one uncomfortable truth. Your desire to share your goals isn't enthusiasm, it's appetite. The appetite for recognition that arrives before you've done anything to earn it. What follows is an examination of that appetite. Where it comes from, what it costs you, and what becomes possible when you stop feeding it. You don't have to be mysterious. You don't have to be cold or secretive or allergic to human connection. You just have to learn the difference between the people who talk about building something and the people who actually build it. The difference is quieter than you'd expect. Chapter 1. Your brain already thinks you won. There's a study most people have heard of, but very few have taken seriously enough. Participants were split into two groups. Both groups had the same goal. One group kept it private. The other announced it to the room. Then everyone got to work. The ones who announced their goals quit earlier, performed worse, felt less motivated to continue. And here's the part that should bother you. They reported feeling more confident going in. This is not a quirk. This is not an outlier finding buried in an obscure journal. This is your brain doing exactly what it was designed to do. And that design is working against you in a way that feels, from the inside, like support. When you tell someone your goal and they respond with encouragement, a nod, that's amazing, a string of fire emojis, whatever the modern equivalent of tribal approval looks like, your brain releases dopamine. The same dopamine it would release if you had actually made progress. The same neurotransmitter involved in finishing the thing, celebrating the milestone, crossing the line. Your brain is not sophisticated enough to care about the difference between earning a reward and receiving one. It just registers the chemical, marks something as partially resolved, and quietly, without asking your permission, reduces the urgency to continue. Psychologists call this social reality. The moment you speak an intention aloud and receive positive feedback, your mind begins treating it as partially real, not metaphorically, neurologically. The goal-related tension that would have driven you toward action has been, not eliminated, but bled. Like a tire with a slow leak. You can still move, just not as fast, not as far, and with more effort than it should take. I watched this happen to someone I considered genuinely talented. He'd been sitting on a business idea for 2 years, turning it over quietly, doing the unglamorous background work of actually understanding the market. Then he went to a dinner party and told the table about it. The reaction was warm, People were interested. Someone said it sounded like something that could really work. He never built it. Not because he was lazy, because something shifted after that dinner that he couldn't name and I couldn't fully explain to him at the time. The hunger was just different, softer. The cruel mechanics of this are worth sitting with. Your brain evolved in an environment where planning and communicating plans were often as valuable as execution. In a small tribe, telling the group what you intended to do served a coordination function. Social approval for your intentions meant the group was aligned. It meant you weren't alone. It meant survival was more likely. That system made sense then. It does not make sense now. Now you are not coordinating a hunt. You are trying to build something in a world that will absolutely not stop existing while you do it, surrounded by people whose approval does nothing to help your actual goal and everything to satisfy the part of your brain that wants to stop trying so hard. The approval arrives. The urgency leaves. You are left with a goal that feels somehow less pressing than it did before you talked about it, and you have no idea why. The people who seem to have inexhaustible drive, the ones who finish things, who show up long after other people have quietly stopped, are not more motivated than you in any raw, inherent sense. They are not wired differently or gifted with unusual discipline from birth. What they've learned, consciously or through experience, is not to spend the currency before they've earned it. They feel the impulse to share. Everyone does. The pull toward telling someone, toward making the goal feel real through social acknowledgement, is not a weakness. It is human. What separates them is that they recognize the impulse for what it is and choose differently. Not because silence is noble, because silence works. Your brain already thinks you won the moment you told someone. The only way to correct that miscalculation is to stop giving it the data it's using to reach that conclusion. Keep the goal internal. Let the tension build. Let the urgency stay uncomfortable instead of releasing it into a room full of people who will forget the conversation by Thursday. The discomfort of an unshared goal is not a problem to solve. It's the engine. And most people are venting it before they ever get anywhere. Chapter 2. The applause arrives before the performance. Somewhere right now, someone is posting about the book they're going to write. In 6 months, they will post about a different book they're going to write. The first book will not exist. Neither will the second. But the posts will be polished. The caption will be earnest. And the comments will be full of people saying you've got this and can't wait to read it. The person will feel genuinely moved by the support. They will close the app and feel for a few hours like a writer. They are not a writer. They are someone who has learned to harvest the feeling of being a writer without doing the writing. This is not a character flaw, it is an optimization. The brain found a shortcut to the reward, and it is taking it every time because that is what brains do. The shortcut is the announcement. What makes the announcement so effective as a dopamine delivery system is that it requires almost nothing. You don't need results. You don't need progress. You don't need to have done anything except decide, with enough conviction to say out loud, that you are going to. That decision, stated publicly, received warmly, triggers a response in your social brain that is nearly indistinguishable from minor achievement. And minor achievement feels good enough to temporarily kill the drive toward major achievement. Think about the last time you saw someone announce a significant goal: new business, fitness transformation, creative project, career change. Think about the energy in that announcement, the clarity of vision, the detail, the enthusiasm. Now think about what happened 6 weeks later. In most cases, nothing. Not a dramatic failure, not a public collapse, just a quiet fading. The updates stopped. The project stopped being mentioned. Life moved on and absorbed the whole thing without leaving a mark. People look at this pattern and call it lack of follow-through, weak willpower, poor discipline. What it actually is, most of the time, is a brain that got what it came for and stopped sending the signal to continue. The announcement cycle completed. The social reward arrived. The psychological need for recognition, which was always the deeper driver, got satisfied. And so the behavior that satisfied it stopped. I've done this. Years ago, I told 3 different people about a writing project I was starting. Each conversation went well. I felt supported. I felt like the project was real in a way it hadn't been before I said it out loud. Then I sat down to actually write it and found, to my genuine confusion, that I had almost no appetite for the work. It wasn't writer's block. It was something quieter and harder to name, a flatness where urgency should have been. The tank wasn't full. It had already been partially drained through my mouth. The announcement cycle has a structure worth understanding, because once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. It begins with a genuine impulse, a real desire to achieve something. That desire creates internal tension, which is uncomfortable but productive. The tension is what drives action. Then comes the announcement, which releases the tension socially before any action has occurred. The release feels good. The positive response reinforces the announcement behavior. The tension, the engine, dissipates. What's left is the goal, still technically on the list, but now stripped of the psychological pressure that would have actually moved it forward. This is why people are chronic restarters. They don't keep abandoning goals because they're not serious about them. They keep abandoning goals because they keep releasing the productive tension before the work begins, and then they wait to feel it again. They set the goal again. Tell someone again. Feel the charge again. Lose it again. Some people run this loop for years, genuinely baffled by their own inconsistency. The fix is not, as most productivity advice suggests, finding better accountability partners, or more sophisticated tracking systems, or morning routines aggressive enough to override human psychology. The fix is simpler and considerably less comfortable. Stop announcing. Let the tension stay internal. Let it build until it has nowhere to go except into the actual work. Uncomfortable is the correct feeling. That restless, slightly anxious energy you feel when you have a goal you haven't told anyone about. That is not a problem. That is fuel being stored instead of burned in a conversation. The book that doesn't get posted about is the book that sometimes gets written. The business that doesn't get announced at a dinner party is sometimes the business that actually gets built. Not always. Silence is not magic. Execution still requires execution. But it turns out that's much easier when you haven't already taken a bow. Chapter 3. Validation is a sedative. Encouragement feels like fuel. It is not. It's a painkiller. And it numbs the exact discomfort that would have driven you forward. This is the part nobody wants to hear, because the people offering encouragement mean well. They genuinely want good things for you. Their support is real. The warmth in their voice when they say, "I believe in you," is not performative. And none of that changes what it does to your neurochemistry, which is approximately the same thing a mild sedative does to your nervous system. It takes the edge off. It reduces the sharpness of the thing that was pushing you. The edge is what you needed. Significant goals are not achieved in comfort. They are achieved through a sustained tolerance for discomfort. The discomfort of not knowing if it's working, of doing the unglamorous, repetitive work before results appear, of sitting alone with something unfinished and resisting the urge to declare it good enough. That discomfort is not incidental to the process. It is the process. Remove it, and you remove the mechanism. Validation removes it. Efficiently, pleasantly, with the best intentions. Here is the specific mechanism. Every meaningful goal involves a gap between where you are and where you want to be. That gap creates psychological tension. The tension is unpleasant. Your brain's job is to close it. It can close the gap two ways: through achievement, which takes effort and time, or through social signals that indicate you are on the right track and therefore reduce the urgency to close it immediately. Validation is the second option. It tells your brain, you are seen, you are supported, your direction is approved. The gap doesn't close, but the alarm quiets. And once the alarm quiets, the urgency that would have dragged you out of bed early or kept you at the desk an hour longer simply doesn't arrive with the same force. Most people interpret this as motivation that ran out. It didn't run out. It was redirected into a social transaction and spent there. The validation trap is particularly hard to escape because it compounds across relationships. Your partner is encouraging. Your friends are supportive. Your colleagues seem impressed. Each individual interaction feels minor. A comment here, a reaction there. But the cumulative effect is a sustained low-level satisfaction that continuously bleeds the urgency out of your most important goals. You are never hungry because you are being fed small amounts constantly. A mentor told me something once that I found deeply annoying at the time and have not been able to stop thinking about since. He said the most dangerous period for any goal is right after someone tells you it's a good idea. He wasn't being contrarian. He had watched too many genuinely promising things stall immediately after receiving their first real validation. The person worked hardest when they weren't sure it was good. The moment someone confirmed it was good, the edge left the work. Not entirely, not obviously, just enough. The uncomfortable truth is that doubt, the private, unshared uncertainty about whether this will actually work, is one of the most productive psychological states available to you. It keeps you honest. It keeps you working. It keeps you checking your assumptions instead of defending them. Validation collapses doubt. That feels like progress. It is the opposite of progress. This doesn't mean you should surround yourself with critics or deliberately seek discouragement. That's a different mistake with different costs. What it means is that the internal uncertainty you feel about your goals before external input arrives is not a problem requiring a solution. It is the condition under which serious work gets done. Protect it. Don't rush to dissolve it in a conversation. There is also a subtler version of the validation trap that operates entirely inside your own head. Every time you imagine how people will react when you share your progress, every time you rehearse the conversation where you explain what you've accomplished, you are receiving a simulated version of the same social reward. Your brain doesn't fully distinguish between the imagined approval and the real thing. The mild dopamine release happens either way. This means you can drain the tank without saying a word to anyone, simply by spending too much time imagining the moment you get to say something. The people who consistently finish hard things have learned, one way or another, to be suspicious of anything that feels like reward before the work is done. Not paranoid, not joyless. Just precise about when satisfaction is earned and when it's borrowed. Borrowed satisfaction spends fine. It just leaves you owing something you may not want to pay later. Chapter 4. The room full of people who want you to stay. Nobody throws a party when you outgrow them. They don't announce it. They don't gather in a room and decide. It happens quietly, in small adjustments. A slightly cooler tone, an offhand comment that lands wrong, a pattern of advice that consistently points you back toward familiar ground. The people who love you most are sometimes the most effective at keeping you exactly where you are. This is not malice. It is something more complicated than malice, and considerably harder to defend against. Human beings are deeply, structurally uncomfortable with change in people they're close to. Not because they're selfish, though that's part of it, but because your identity in the minds of the people around you functions as a fixed point. They've built their understanding of themselves partly in relation to who you are. When you change significantly, that reference point moves. And moving reference points feel, neurologically, like instability, like threat. Your growth doesn't just challenge you, it challenges their internal architecture. So when you announce a goal that represents real change, a career shift, a serious fitness transformation, a financial ambition that exceeds anything you've previously attempted, you are not just sharing information. You are issuing a quiet disruption to everyone in earshot who has a stake in the current version of you. And most of the people closest to you have that stake, whether they know it or not. The response rarely looks like resistance. That would be too easy to identify and dismiss. It looks like concern. It looks like realism. It looks like a friend who's been around long enough to remember the last time you tried something like this, and gently, warmly, with genuine affection, reminds you of that. You always do this in January. I just don't want you to get hurt again. Have you really thought about what that would require? Every one of these is a hand on your shoulder, pulling back, dressed as care. The people who are actively changing their own lives rarely say these things. They're busy. They know how hard it is. They understand that doubt is already doing its job internally and doesn't need outside reinforcement. The people most likely to raise concerns about your ambitions are, almost without exception, the people who have quietly abandoned their own. This is not an accusation. It is a psychological pattern with a mechanism. When someone around you pursues a goal they haven't pursued, it creates what researchers call an upward social comparison. You are above them on the dimension they care about. That comparison is uncomfortable. The brain resolves uncomfortable comparisons in one of two ways: by closing the gap or by pulling the other person down. Closing the gap requires effort. Pulling down requires only a few well-placed words. Most people choose the words, without knowing that's what they're doing. I've been in a room where someone announced they were leaving a stable job to start a business, watched the faces. The initial enthusiasm was genuine. Nobody was faking it. But within 4 minutes, the questions started shifting. The timeline seemed aggressive. The market seemed risky. Had they considered what would happen to their health insurance? The conversation didn't sabotage them because it was malicious. It sabotaged them because 10 caring people with unresolved ambitions of their own were, without realizing it, processing their own discomfort through someone else's decision. The person walked in energized and walked out managing doubt they hadn't arrived with. This is why the timing of disclosure matters enormously. An early-stage goal, fragile, unproven, not yet supported by evidence, is maximally vulnerable to this kind of social weather. It hasn't built up enough momentum to withstand the friction of other people's fears. One thoughtful-sounding concern from someone you trust can recalibrate your entire internal estimate of what's possible. A goal with 6 months of quiet, private work behind it is a different thing entirely. It has evidence. It has small wins accumulated without an audience. It has a track record that exists in your own experience regardless of what anyone else thinks. By the time the people around you find out about it, it's no longer fragile enough to be dislodged by a worried look across a dinner table. Silence isn't about distrust. The people in your life are not your enemies. Most of them are doing their best with the psychology they have. But their psychology is not neutral. It has its own agenda, its own comfort zone, its own subtle preference for a world where everyone stays approximately where they are. You don't have to protect yourself from the people you love. You just have to stop handing them the thing most likely to trigger the part of them that would rather you didn't change. Build first. Show them after. They'll adjust. Chapter 5. Explaining is procrastination with better posture. Every conversation about your plan is a conversation instead of your plan. This sounds obvious until you start counting. The coffee where you walked someone through your idea. The text thread where you clarified your timeline. The dinner where you answered questions about your approach for 40 minutes and came home feeling like you'd done something. Added up across a week, across a month. The hours are not trivial, and that's before accounting for what happens inside your head after each one. The processing, the second-guessing, the mental energy spent integrating other people's reactions into your already complicated relationship with your own goal. Explanation is expensive. It just doesn't feel that way because it's social, and social things feel productive even when they aren't. The deeper problem is not the time. It's the cognitive cost. Every time you explain your goal to someone new, you are not simply relaying information. You are performing a real-time translation of a half-formed internal vision into language clear enough for someone else to follow. That translation requires active construction. You have to simplify things that aren't simple yet. You have to present as decided things that are still in motion. You have to hold the whole shape of the goal in working memory while simultaneously reading the other person's face and adjusting accordingly. This is exhausting in a way that doesn't show on the outside. You finish the conversation and feel fine. 3 hours later, you sit down to actually work on the goal and find that the specific mental space it requires feels somehow occupied. Cluttered. Like a desk that looks clean but has too many tabs open behind the screen. You weren't tired from the conversation. You were depleted by the translation. There is also a subtler cost that compounds over time. Each explanation commits you, slightly, to whatever version of the goal you described. You said the timeline was 6 months. Now 6 months is the timeline, not because the work requires 6 months, but because you told someone 6 months, and changing it would require another explanation. You said you were taking approach A. Now you're somewhat attached to approach A, not because it's best, but because walking it back means admitting publicly that your initial thinking was incomplete. The goal stops being a living, adaptable thing and becomes a narrative you're obligated to maintain. Unexplained goals stay fluid. They can shift based on new information without the friction of social continuity. You can abandon an approach on Tuesday that wasn't working and try something different on Wednesday, and nobody needs to know because nobody knew about the first approach. This flexibility is not indecisiveness. It is the natural behavior of someone who is actually doing the work and responding to what they find, rather than performing consistency for an audience. The explaining habit also invites a specific kind of interference that masquerades as help. When you explain your goal to someone, they feel genuinely, not manipulatively, that they now have a stake in it. They offered their attention and their reactions and their time. In exchange, they become, in their own minds, a minor stakeholder. This is a social contract that operates below the level of anyone's conscious awareness, and stakeholders give input. The input is almost always sincere. It is also almost always filtered through the stakeholders' own experience, their own fears, their own previous attempts at something vaguely similar, and their own conclusions about what is and isn't possible. None of this has anything to do with your specific situation, but it arrives dressed as relevant advice, and your brain, which is socially wired and prone to updating on new information, takes it seriously anyway. You change something, or you spend a week deciding whether to change something. Either way, you're no longer working on the goal. You're managing the aftermath of having explained it. I have a clear memory of spending an entire afternoon responding to follow-up questions about a project I'd mentioned offhandedly to someone the week before. They were curious. Their questions were good. The conversation was genuinely interesting. I closed my laptop that evening, having produced nothing, and feeling, in some foggy way, like I'd been productive. It took me a few days to realize I had simply performed productivity in social form, while the actual work sat untouched. The most efficient workers you will ever encounter share a quality that is easy to misread as coldness. They are not forthcoming about what they're working on, not because they're secretive by nature, but because they've learned that talking about the work and doing the work draw from the same account. And they've made a decision, maybe consciously, maybe through accumulated experience, about which one gets funded. They're not being mysterious. They're being economical. There is a version of explanation that is genuinely necessary. Sharing information that serves a direct functional purpose, briefing someone whose cooperation you actually need, communicating with a partner whose life is affected by your choices. None of that is waste. What is waste is the ambient social narration of your goals, the updates offered to people who didn't ask, the detailed breakdowns shared with people who can't do anything with the information. That particular kind of explaining has one real function. It makes the goal feel more real without requiring you to do anything real, which is, when you say it plainly, the definition of procrastination. Just with considerably better posture. Chapter 6. Silence is not secrecy, it's strategy. Keeping your goals private isn't about hiding. It's about not letting other people's ceilings become your floor. There is a version of silence that is fearful. The person who doesn't share because they're afraid of judgment, afraid of accountability, afraid of what happens if they tell someone and then fail. That silence is avoidance. It has a particular quality to it, a kind of held breath, a reluctance rather than a decision. That is not what this is. Strategic silence is different. It is chosen. It comes from understanding exactly what gets protected when you stop broadcasting your intentions, and exactly what gets lost when you don't. It is not the absence of confidence. It is one of confidence's less obvious expressions. The distinction matters because people often conflate the two. They hear, "keep your goals private," and assume it means retreat, pull back, trust no one, operate in isolation. What it actually means is something more precise. Be intentional about what you share, with whom, and when, based on what serves the work, rather than what satisfies the social impulse. Strategic silence is an active state, not a passive one. When you stop explaining your goals to people who can't affect their outcome, something specific happens to your relationship with the goal itself. It stops being a social object, something that exists partly in other people's minds, partly in the version you described to them, partly in the expectations they formed from that description. It becomes entirely yours again. The goal lives only in your experience of working toward it. Nobody else has a mental model of it to be disappointed by, confused by, or skeptical of. This matters more than it sounds. A goal that exists only in your own experience is radically free. It can change shape without betraying anyone's expectations. It can slow down without requiring an explanation. It can pivot without triggering a conversation about whether you're being consistent. The absence of an external audience is not a limitation. It is operational freedom. Silent work also does something interesting to your perception of difficulty. When nobody is watching, difficulty doesn't have a social dimension. It is just a problem to be solved. You don't have to perform resilience for an audience or manage the optics of struggle. You can be genuinely stuck, genuinely confused, genuinely slower than you expected, and none of that has any meaning beyond its practical reality. The hard parts stay hard, but they don't also become embarrassing. This is more valuable than it appears. A significant portion of the energy people lose during difficult periods goes not toward solving the difficulty, but toward managing how it looks. Toward maintaining the narrative they established publicly when things were going well. Toward deciding what to say when people ask how it's going, and the honest answer is, not well, and I'm not sure why. Silent work eliminates that entire layer. Hard is just hard. You deal with it and move. There is also a competitive dimension to strategic silence that rarely gets discussed directly, but is worth naming. In almost any domain, professional, creative, entrepreneurial, the person who is visibly working on something has given others time to respond, time to prepare, to imitate, to preempt, to position themselves advantageously relative to what you've announced. The person working invisibly has no such problem. They emerge with something complete, while everyone else was still deciding how to react to the announcement. This is not paranoia. It is just the realistic acknowledgement that other people's interests and your interests are not always aligned, and that information shared is information that can be used. Not always against you, but not always for you either. The most elegant competitive advantages are the ones your competitors don't know they should be defending against. Strategic silence also forces a quality of thinking that public work does not. When you know you will have to explain your approach to others, you unconsciously optimize for explainability. You favor approaches that are easy to describe, logical sounding in conversation, defensible to a generalist audience. You avoid the moves that are hard to justify, but might be exactly right. Private work has no such constraint. You can take the action that makes sense to you based on what you're actually seeing, without filtering it through what would make sense to someone who isn't seeing what you're seeing. Some of the best decisions are unjustifiable to anyone who wasn't there. What silent work is not is lonely, necessarily. There is a meaningful difference between keeping your goals private and pursuing them in complete isolation. You can have people in your life who know you deeply, who you trust genuinely, who are invested in your success in a way that is functional rather than merely social. Those people exist. They are worth finding and keeping. The distinction is that they know about your goals because their knowing serves a purpose, because their expertise matters, their resources are relevant, their judgment is calibrated and useful. Not because you needed an audience and they were available. Strategy is always about allocation. Time, energy, attention, information, all of it gets allocated based on what it produces. Silence is what happens when you look at the cost of broadcasting your intentions, compare it to the return, and decide the math doesn't work. It is not a wall, it is a door with a lock. You choose who has the key. Chapter 7. The Accountability Lie. You told people your goal to create accountability. What you created was an audience. Those are not the same thing. Accountability has consequences. An audience has opinions. Consequences change behavior. Opinions, when things get hard, mostly get ignored, politely, gradually, and with a perfectly reasonable explanation that everyone accepts because they were never really invested in the first place. This is the accountability lie, and it is one of the most widely distributed pieces of bad advice in the entire self-help ecosystem. Tell someone your goal. Make it public. Create social pressure. The theory sounds behavioral, even scientific. It is neither. It is the productivity equivalent of putting your alarm across the room, a trick that works once on people who were already going to get up. Real accountability is a system with teeth. It has consequences that are immediate, personal, and proportionate to failure. It is structured to make quitting more expensive than continuing. It does not depend on other people's sustained attention, which is finite, inconsistent, and allocated primarily toward their own lives. Social accountability depends on exactly that, other people's sustained attention, which means it is structurally unreliable from the beginning. Think about what actually happens when you announce a goal and people agree to hold you accountable. In week 1, they ask about it. You update them. The social contract feels alive. In week 3, they forget to ask. You don't bring it up because you're behind, and the conversation would be uncomfortable. In week 6, the goal is quietly off the table and nobody mentions it, because mentioning it would require one of you to acknowledge what happened. And neither of you wants that particular conversation. Social accountability doesn't fail dramatically. It just fades. And the fading is so gradual, so mutually convenient, that it barely registers as failure at all. What makes this particularly insidious is that announcing a goal as an accountability measure creates a false sense of having done something structural. You feel like you've built a safety net. You haven't. You've told people you're going to try something and they've wished you luck. That is not a safety net. That is a social nicety that will be extended regardless of outcome. Real accountability structures look nothing like announcements. They look like financial stakes. Money already committed that you lose if you don't follow through. They look like signed contracts with real deadlines attached to real consequences. They look like events you've registered for that require you to be ready by a specific date. Not because someone will be disappointed if you're not, but because the date exists independently of anyone's feelings about it. The difference is that these structures do not require anyone's ongoing attention to function. They work the same whether the people around you remember your goal or not, whether they ask about it or not, whether they care this week or not. The consequence is baked in. The pressure is structural, not social. I once agreed to split a financial penalty with someone if either of us didn't complete a project by a specific date. Neither of us particularly wanted to lose the money. Neither of us wanted to be the one who cost the other person money either. The goal got done. Not because of inspiration, not because we checked in regularly with warm, supportive updates, because the structure made completion cheaper than failure. That is accountability. Everything else is theater. The deeper problem with the announcement as accountability approach is what it does to your internal relationship with the goal. When your accountability is external, located in other people's expectations and follow-up questions, your motivation becomes dependent on their attention level. When they're asking, you feel accountable. When they stop asking, the pressure drops. Your commitment is now a function of someone else's curiosity, which is not a foundation anyone should be building on. Internal accountability works differently. It is a commitment made to yourself in private that operates independent of external conditions. It is the standard you hold yourself to when nobody is watching and there is nothing in the environment pushing you toward it except your own judgment about who you want to be and what you said you would do. This kind of accountability is built slowly, through the accumulation of kept promises made only to yourself. Every time you do the thing you said you would do, when no one would know and nothing would happen if you didn't, the internal standard gets stronger. Every time you don't, it gets weaker. The ledger is private, but the balance is real, and you feel it, even if you can't always name what you're feeling. The people who are genuinely difficult to derail from their goals are almost always people who have built this internal standard over years of private kept commitments. They are not more accountable to others. They are more accountable to themselves, which turns out to be the only kind that compounds. What social accountability produces, at best, is performance. You behave well when people are watching. You maintain the appearance of progress for as long as the attention lasts. And then the attention moves on, as attention always does, and you are left alone with the goal and the question of whether you were ever actually committed or just performing commitment for the duration of the audience's interest. The answer, in most cases, is not encouraging. The goal you keep because someone is watching, and the goal you keep because you decided to, these are not the same goal. They require different things, produce different results, and say completely different things about who you are becoming in the process of pursuing them. One of them depends on a variable outside your control. The other one doesn't. Build the one that doesn't. Chapter 8. What momentum actually looks like. Real momentum is quiet. It doesn't look like anything on the outside. That's the point. Most people's mental image of momentum is wrong. They picture visible acceleration, increasing output, expanding activity, a person clearly going somewhere fast. What they're actually picturing is the performance of momentum, which is a different thing entirely and considerably less useful. Real momentum is internal. It's the compound effect of consistent small actions accumulating below the threshold of anyone's observation, including sometimes your own. The first weeks of real momentum feel like nothing. You do the work. Nothing appears to change. You do it again. Still nothing. The feedback loop is so slow and so quiet that most people interpret the silence as evidence that the approach isn't working. They're wrong. They're just in the early stage of a process that doesn't announce its progress until it's ready, which it never is on anyone else's timeline. This is exactly when most people start broadcasting. Not because things are going well, nothing is visibly going well yet, but because they need the external signal to confirm they're on the right track. The internal signal isn't strong enough yet. The work hasn't produced results that feel real. So they translate the effort into language and offer it to other people, and wait for the response to tell them whether to continue. The response tells them nothing useful, but it feels like something. And something, at this stage, is enough to keep going for another week. This is the trap. The external signal becomes a substitute for the internal signal. And once that substitution is established, the person needs the external signal to function. They have outsourced their feedback loop to people who are not inside the work and cannot actually evaluate it. They are now dependent on the continued attention and enthusiasm of an audience that has its own life, its own fluctuating interest, and absolutely no obligation to stay curious about someone else's progress indefinitely. When the audience moves on, and it always does, the momentum collapses. Not because the work stopped working, because the scaffolding the person built their motivation on got quietly removed. Private momentum doesn't have this vulnerability. When you build momentum without broadcasting it, the feedback loop stays internal. Your signal comes from the work itself, from the small, accumulating evidence that you are getting better, that the approach is developing, that the thing is becoming more real with each session. This signal is slower to arrive than social validation. It is also infinitely more reliable because it comes from the actual territory rather than from someone else's reaction to your description of the territory. There is a specific quality to the feeling of private momentum that is worth learning to recognize. It doesn't feel like excitement. It feels more like gravity, a quiet pull toward the work, a mild but persistent sense that something is building, a reluctance to stop that isn't quite enthusiasm but is more reliable than enthusiasm because it doesn't depend on mood or circumstance. It shows up even on bad days. It survives interruptions. It is not loud enough to post about, which is precisely why it lasts. Excitement is a weather event. Gravity is a physical constant. The broadcasting habit also disrupts momentum through a mechanism that rarely gets named directly. It breaks the trance. Serious work, the kind that produces real results, requires sustained immersion. You have to stay inside the problem long enough for something to shift. This takes time, and it takes a particular quality of uninterrupted attention that is incompatible with the fragmented, socially oriented mindset that comes with documenting and sharing your process. Every time you step out of the work to describe the work, you are breaking the trance. You surface, you translate, you perform. And then you try to go back under. But the water is different now. You are not where you were. Something has been reset. The people who go deepest into their work, who produce things with real density and originality, are almost always people who have learned to stay under, to resist the surface, to let the work be unwitnessed for longer than is comfortable. The discomfort of not surfacing, of not updating anyone, of not converting the process into communication. That discomfort is the friction that generates depth. Shallow work is almost always work that got surfaced too often. Momentum also requires the freedom to fail quietly. This is perhaps the most underappreciated operational advantage of private work. When no one knows what you're attempting, a failed attempt is just information. It tells you something about the approach that you can use to adjust. There is no social dimension to it, no narrative to manage, no audience to explain yourself to. You try, it doesn't work. You learn, you try differently. This is the actual mechanism of improvement. It is rapid, iterative, and entirely incompatible with the pressure to maintain a consistent public narrative about your progress. When you've announced your approach publicly, a failed attempt becomes a social event. You have to decide what to tell people. You have to manage their revised expectations. You have to either explain the failure or perform confidence you don't feel about a pivot they didn't know was coming. All of this takes energy that would otherwise go toward the next attempt. The failure costs twice, once in the actual work and once in the social aftermath. Private failure costs once, and it teaches more because you're not spending cognitive resources on how to frame it. Build quietly long enough, and something happens that is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. The work develops its own weight, its own internal logic, its own momentum in the original sense of the word. Mass times velocity, a thing in motion that requires real force to stop. By the time anyone finds out what you've been doing, the project has accumulated enough of its own reality that other people's opinions about it are largely irrelevant. Not because you've become indifferent to feedback, because the thing you've built is already more real than anyone's reaction to it. That is what momentum actually looks like. From the outside, it looks like nothing for a very long time. And then it looks like something that appeared without warning. Chapter 9. When results appear without warning. There is a particular silence that falls over a room when someone does something no one expected. That silence is respect. the kind you can't ask for. You know this silence. You've been in the room when it happened to someone else. The person who'd been quietly working on something while everyone else was busy forming opinions about their potential. Then the thing appeared. Complete, real, undeniable, and the room recalibrated. Not loudly, not with ceremony. Just that pause, that subtle collective adjustment, that moment when everyone's mental model of who that person was got updated without their permission. That silence is worth more than any amount of prior encouragement. And it is only available to people who didn't spend the building phase seeking encouragement. The psychology of unexpected success is distinct from the psychology of announced success, and the distinction runs deeper than optics. When people have followed your journey, when they've watched you struggle, seen your setbacks, formed opinions about your likelihood of success, their eventual acknowledgement of your achievement is filtered through everything they witnessed. They can point to the help you received. They remember the version of you that wasn't sure. They have context that allows them to explain your success in ways that preserve their prior assessment of your limits. None of this is conscious. None of it is malicious. It is just how the mind protects its existing models from the disruption of new information. It assimilates rather than accommodates. It files your success under a category that keeps the world making sense. But when success arrives without buildup, when there was no journey to observe, no narrative to integrate it into, the mind has nowhere to file it except under competence. Undiluted, unexplained, not reducible to circumstances anyone witnessed. The achievement stands alone. And achievements that stand alone are significantly harder to minimize. This is the amplification effect, and it operates consistently enough to be worth building into your strategy rather than leaving to chance. There is also something that happens to your own relationship with unexpected success that differs from announced success. When you've told people you were going to do something, and then you do it, the achievement confirms a narrative. It lands as expected. The emotional response is satisfaction, real, legitimate, but contained within the shape of what was already anticipated. When you've told nobody, and then you do it, the achievement has no pre-existing container. It lands differently, larger, more surprising even to yourself, because some part of you was never entirely sure, and you did it anyway. Without witnesses, without a safety net of other people's expectations to catch you if you fell. The pride in that is specific, and it doesn't fade the way announced achievement does. It becomes part of how you understand yourself, quietly and permanently. I finished something significant once, a project that had taken much longer than I'd expected and had been considerably harder than I'd anticipated, and told no one for 3 days. Not strategically. I just didn't feel the urgency to announce it. I sat with it privately and noticed what that felt like. It felt heavier and more real than anything I'd previously finished with an audience. The accomplishment wasn't shared, so it was entirely mine in a way that outcomes tracked publicly never quite are. When I eventually mentioned it, the reaction was secondary, almost beside the point. Unexpected results also reposition you in a way that announced intentions never can. Intentions position you as someone who wants to do something. Results position you as someone who does things. These are different categories in other people's minds, and the movement between them cannot be accomplished through better announcements or more compelling explanations. It can only be accomplished by producing something real and letting it speak without introduction. The repositioning has practical consequences. People make decisions about who to trust, who to collaborate with, who to bring opportunities to, based on their model of what you actually produce, rather than what you claim to be working toward. A history of unexpected results builds a particular kind of reputation, not for enthusiasm or ambition, or even for effort, but for delivery. For being the kind of person who appears with things finished, while everyone else is still discussing their plans. This reputation compounds in a way that announced intention never does. Each unexpected result updates the model further. Over time, the expectation becomes, something is probably happening that we don't know about yet. Which means that when you do eventually share something, it lands with the accumulated weight of prior reliable delivery rather than the hollow ring of prior reliable announcement. The people most worth impressing are almost always unimpressed by announcements. They have seen too many announcements. They have watched too many compelling pitches lead nowhere, and too many unremarkable-sounding plans become something real. They have learned to wait for the evidence and reserve their serious attention for people who produce it. Surprising these people is not difficult. You just have to work quietly long enough to show up with something they didn't know was coming. The bar for this is lower than it appears, because most people cannot resist telling these same people what they're working on before it's done. The field of people who simply appear with finished work is remarkably uncrowded. There is a practical discipline to developing this capacity that goes beyond simply keeping your mouth shut. It requires tolerating the discomfort of being underestimated. While you're working, people may assume you're not doing much. They may form opinions about your ambition or your capability that are unflattering and incorrect. You have to let those opinions sit there uncorrected, which requires a specific kind of confidence. Not the confidence that needs to be seen, but the confidence that can wait. Waiting is a skill. Most people treat it as a cost. The ones who appear without warning have learned to treat it as an investment. The silence before emergence is not empty. It is full of work. And the moment of emergence, when the silence breaks and the thing you built appears without introduction, carries the weight of everything that happened in the quiet. That weight is what other people feel when the room goes still. That silence is the sound of your results doing the talking. Chapter 10. The algorithm is not your friend. Social media didn't invent your need for validation. It just built a machine that runs on it. And the machine is very good at its job. Better than you are at resisting it most days. Better than your intentions, your discipline, your genuine desire to focus on what matters. The machine was designed by teams of engineers whose sole professional purpose was to make it more compelling than whatever else you might be doing. It is optimized, tested, iterated, and refined against the specific contours of human psychology in ways that your willpower, which evolved to handle a very different set of problems, was never equipped to counter. This is not a fair fight. It was not designed to be. The fundamental business model is straightforward once you see it. The platform makes money when you are on the platform. Not when you are building something, growing something, finishing something, when you are on the platform. Scrolling, posting, reacting, comparing. Every minute you spend documenting your goals is a minute the platform monetized. Every minute you spend working toward your goals is a minute that doesn't exist, as far as the platform is concerned, because it produces no engagement data and no advertising inventory. The platform is structurally indifferent to your success. It is structurally dependent on your distraction. The mechanism it uses to capture you is not complicated, but it is effective with a consistency that should alarm anyone who has watched themselves reach for a phone without deciding to. It uses variable ratio reinforcement, the same schedule that makes slot machines the most addictive form of gambling ever designed. You post something. Sometimes you get significant response. Sometimes almost nothing. You never know in advance which it will be. This unpredictability is not a design flaw. It is the design. The unpredictable reward keeps you posting, keeps you checking, keeps you returning to pull the lever again because this time might be the time it pays out. Your goal, under these conditions, becomes content. Raw material for the machine. You stop pursuing it and start packaging it. You stop working and start producing documentation of working, which feels similar from the inside, but produces completely different outputs. The packaging instinct is subtle and worth examining closely. When you know you might share something, you begin, unconsciously, before you've decided anything, optimizing for shareability. You choose the angle that photographs well over the angle that works best. You select the milestone worth posting about over the milestone worth reaching. You frame your struggle in language that will resonate with an audience rather than language that accurately describes what's happening. You are no longer inside the work. You are hovering slightly above it, camera in hand, deciding how to present it. This hovering has a cost that shows up in the quality of the output. The best work, the work with real density, real originality, real specificity, almost always comes from people who were so far inside the work that they forgot to manage how it looked. The hovering prevents that depth. You cannot be fully immersed and simultaneously concerned with the surface. The comparison culture the platform generates is its own separate damage. The feed is not a random sample of reality. It is algorithmically curated to maximize engagement, which means it systematically surfaces the most dramatic, the most impressive, the most extreme versions of everything. You are not seeing how people's goals actually progress. You are seeing the moments they selected for maximum effect, filtered through an algorithm that promotes whatever generated the most response last time. Against this curated highlight reel, your actual experience, which contains significant amounts of confusion, slow progress, and days where nothing visible happens, will always compare unfavorably. This is not because your experience is worse. It is because the comparison is between reality and performance wins that contest every time. The result is a persistent, low-level demoralization that most people attribute to personal inadequacy rather than to the structural distortion of the information environment they're consuming. They think they're falling behind. They're actually just watching a competition that was staged. The platform also shortens your relationship with time in ways that are hostile to serious goal pursuit. Everything on the feed is now. Breaking, trending, just posted, updated 2 minutes ago. This temporal compression trains your attention toward the immediate and the reactive, which is the opposite of the patient, sustained focus that meaningful goals require. You need to be able to sit with slow progress, with invisible accumulation, with the long, quiet middle of any ambitious project. The feed trains you to find this intolerable. A person who has spent years consuming content in a format that refreshes every 30 seconds will find it genuinely difficult to spend 3 hours inside a single problem. Not because they lack intelligence or discipline, because the attentional system has been recalibrated toward a rhythm incompatible with deep work. This recalibration is reversible, but it takes longer than people expect and requires more deliberate management than most people apply. The platform doesn't announce what it's doing to your attention. It just does it quietly in the background while you are busy thinking about something else. None of this requires the platform to be malicious. The engineers are not scheming against your personal development. They are optimizing for engagement metrics, which happen to be in direct conflict with your ability to do serious work. The conflict is structural, not intentional. But structural conflicts don't care about intentions. They produce outcomes regardless. What changes when you understand the machine is not that you necessarily abandon it entirely, though some people find that useful, but that you stop being confused about whose interests it serves. You stop mistaking its rewards for signals about your actual progress. You stop letting its metrics influence your understanding of what matters. You use it on your terms, for purposes you've chosen, in windows you've defined. You don't let it define the rhythm of your day, or the measure of your worth, or the timeline of your disclosure. The machine will keep running. It doesn't need you specifically. There are millions of other people who will feed it today. What it cannot do is make you successful. That part was never on the menu. Chapter 11. Building your own engine. At some point, borrowed fuel runs out every single time. It doesn't matter how much encouragement you started with, how warm the initial reception was, how many people told you they believed in you. External motivation has a half-life. It decays at a rate proportional to how far you are from the moment it was given, and how much the work has stopped being exciting to observe. By the time you reach the hard middle of anything worth doing, the part that isn't photogenic, doesn't produce quotable updates, and requires showing up in conditions that nobody would describe as inspiring, borrowed fuel is gone. What you have left is whatever you built yourself. Most people haven't built anything. They've been running on borrowed fuel so consistently, for so long, that they've never had to. Every time the tank ran low, they found another conversation, another post, another person to remind them why they started. The refueling felt like resilience. It was dependency with better branding. Building your own engine means developing the capacity to generate motivation internally, from the work itself, from the identity you're constructing, from the private accumulation of kept commitments that gradually changes how you understand what you're capable of. This is not an inspirational concept. It is a practical skill with a specific development process, and the process is uncomfortable in ways that borrowed fuel consistently prevents you from reaching. The discomfort begins when you remove the external supply and discover what's actually underneath. For most people, what's underneath is not inspiring. It is doubt, ambivalence, a deeply inconvenient awareness of how much easier it would be to do something else. This is not a personal failing. It is the honest starting point. The people who eventually develop genuine internal drive are not people who skipped this part. They are people who sat in it long enough to find something on the other side. What's on the other side is different for everyone, but tends to have a common structure. There is usually a clarification of why the goal actually matters. Not the socially presentable reason, but the real one. The one that doesn't sound impressive in conversation, but is specific enough to be true. There is usually a confrontation with the identity question. Who are you when no one is watching and nothing is forcing you forward? There is usually a renegotiation of standards. What you're actually willing to do, consistently, independent of how you feel on a given day. None of this happens in the presence of external motivation. External motivation keeps the surface too comfortable for the deeper reckoning to occur. The mechanism of internal engine development is simpler than most frameworks suggest. You make a commitment to yourself, privately, with no witnesses. You keep it, despite the presence of every available excuse not to. You notice that you kept it. You make another commitment. You keep that one too. Slowly, through repetition that has no audience and no reward beyond the private knowledge that you did what you said you would do, something accumulates. It is not confidence in the motivational poster sense. It is something quieter and more structural, a revised understanding of your own reliability. You have evidence gathered in private that you can be trusted to follow through when nothing external is pushing you. This evidence changes what you're willing to attempt, because the risk calculus is different when you know you'll actually do the work. I spent a period working on something with no deadline, no accountability partner, no external structure of any kind. Just a private commitment and a daily minimum. The first few weeks were genuinely unpleasant in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not because the work was hard, but because the absence of external validation left a silence I wasn't used to. Nothing confirmed I was on the right track. Nothing rewarded the effort. The only available signal was the work itself, which is a sparse and demanding feedback source when you're not yet far enough in to see results. What I discovered, slowly and without drama, was that the silence became less empty over time. Not because anything external changed, but because I started generating my own signal. The work started telling me things. I started trusting what it told me. The loop closed internally, and once it closed internally, it stopped needing to be validated externally. That closure is what building your own engine actually feels like. Not motivation in the electric, urgent sense. More like the quiet confidence of a system that knows it can run. Internal engines also have a different relationship with failure than externally fueled motivation does. When borrowed fuel hits an obstacle, the obstacle threatens the entire system because the external source of motivation, the encouraging friend, the accountability group, the public commitment, has to be managed in light of the setback. The failure has a social dimension that complicates the practical one. But when the engine is internal, failure is just data. It tells you something about the approach that you can use immediately, without filtering it through anyone else's expectations or reactions. This makes internally motivated people faster learners, not because they're smarter, but because their feedback loops are shorter and less encumbered. They try, fail, adjust, and try again without the overhead of managing a social narrative around each iteration. The other thing that changes when you build your own engine is the quality of the goals you pursue. Borrowed fuel runs on goals that are socially impressive, goals that generate a good response when announced, that sound ambitious enough to attract encouragement, that are legible to people who aren't living your life. Internal fuel runs on goals that are personally true. These are not always the same goals. Sometimes they overlap. Often they don't. The person running on borrowed fuel pursues what generates response. The person running on internal fuel pursues what generates meaning. Meaning is a slower burn than response, but it lasts incomparably longer and produces work that carries a different weight. The specific gravity of something that was built because it mattered to the person building it, not because it would impress the people watching. This is the final and most important thing the internal engine provides. Not just the capacity to persist, but the clarity to persist towards something real. When you don't need external validation to keep going, you stop needing external approval to decide where to go. The goal becomes yours in a way it cannot be when its existence depends on other people's ongoing interest in it. You stop performing ambition. You start having it. That is an engine. Everything else is just a rental. Chapter 12. The person no one saw coming. The most dangerous people in any room are the ones who said nothing for a very long time and then showed you what they'd been doing. Not dangerous in a threatening sense. Dangerous in the way that genuinely surprises you, that forces a recalibration so complete, it briefly makes you question your own judgment. You thought you understood the landscape. You had a working model of who was capable of what. Then someone you'd filed under a comfortable category did something that didn't fit the file, and the whole system had to update. That updating is uncomfortable. It is also, for the person who caused it, deeply satisfying in a way that no amount of prior encouragement could have produced. There is a specific identity at stake in the choice between announcing and executing. Most people don't think of it in those terms because identity feels like something fixed, something you have rather than something you're continuously constructing through the choices you make when no one is paying attention. But identity is precisely that. The accumulated record of what you do when the external pressure to do it is absent. The person who announces is constructing an identity based on stated intention. The person who executes quietly is constructing an identity based on actual behavior. These feel similar from the inside during the building phase. From the outside, after enough time, they are completely unrecognizable as the same thing. Stated intention builds a reputation for aspiration. Actual behavior builds a reputation for competence. Aspiration is cheap because it costs nothing to express. Competence is expensive because it can only be purchased with consistent effort over time. The market for aspiration is crowded, and the currency depreciates quickly. The market for demonstrated competence is perpetually undersupplied, and its currency compounds. The person no one saw coming has been, without realizing it in those terms, cornering that market. What makes this identity shift particularly interesting is that it doesn't happen through decision. You can't decide to become the person no one saw coming in the same way you can decide to change your diet or your schedule. It happens as a consequence of a different set of decisions. The repeated choice to work when no one is watching, to keep a commitment when there's no external pressure to keep it, to pursue a standard that exists only in your own judgment of yourself. The identity is not the goal. It is what you become while pursuing the goal without an audience. I've watched this happen over years in people I know well enough to have seen both the quiet period and the emergence. What's striking is that the transformation from the outside appears sudden. There's the person you knew, and then there's this other version of them, denser somehow, more certain, operating from a different internal position than they did before. But from the inside, from what they describe when you ask them about it, the change was gradual, almost imperceptible day to day, built entirely from the accumulation of private actions that never seemed significant in the moment. The suddenness is an optical illusion produced by the absence of documentation. Because they didn't broadcast the process, there's no record of the intermediate steps. The public version of their story jumps from where they were to where they are, which looks like a leap. It was a walk. A very long, very quiet walk that no one was watching. This has a practical implication that is easy to underestimate. The person who documented their journey publicly has a record of their intermediate states, of the version of themselves that wasn't sure, that struggled visibly, that expressed doubt in posts and comments that still exist somewhere in a feed. That record is not neutral. People who witnessed the uncertain version have it stored alongside the successful version, and the two coexist in ways that subtly shape how the success gets interpreted. The person who worked privately has no such record. They emerge from the quiet with only the result, and results, without documentation of the struggle that produced them, tend to be attributed to inherent capability rather than to accumulated effort, which changes how people relate to them going forward. This attribution shift is not trivial. Being seen as someone with inherent capability opens different doors than being seen as someone who tried hard and eventually succeeded. Both are true in most cases. But which truth people lead with in their mental model of you depends largely on what they observed. And what they observed depends on what you chose to show them. The person no one saw coming chose to show them nothing until there was something worth showing. There is a loneliness to this that deserves acknowledgement without sentimentality. Working towards something significant without anyone knowing, without the small social rewards that make effort feel witnessed. This is genuinely isolating at times. The human need for connection is real and legitimate, and doesn't disappear because you've decided to work quietly. The question is not whether the need exists, but how you meet it. Through the work, through relationships that aren't organized around your goals, through the private satisfaction of progress that doesn't require an audience to be real. The loneliness is the price. The question is what it buys. It buys the uncontaminated version of yourself, the one that develops in the absence of other people's projections, fears, and comfortable assessments of your limits. The one that doesn't have to fit into anyone's prior model of who you are or who you're likely to become. This version is more original and more capable than the version that develops under observation, because it was never constrained by the need to make sense to anyone other than itself. When that version finally appears, when the quiet period ends and the work becomes visible, the room goes still in a particular way. That stillness is recognition. Not of what you announced, of what you became while no one was watching. It cannot be manufactured. It cannot be accelerated. It cannot be replicated by someone who chose the louder path. It is available only to the person who chose the quiet one and stayed there long enough. Chapter 13. The Cost of Being Understood Too Early. The problem with explaining your vision before it exists is that people will understand it, and understanding it will make it smaller. This is not about other people's intelligence or imagination. It is about the fundamental limitation of language as a container for unfinished ideas. When something exists only inside you, not yet built, not yet proven, still in the volatile early state where it could become several different things, it has a quality of openness that is one of its most valuable properties. It hasn't been defined yet, which means it hasn't been limited yet. The moment you describe it to someone, that openness closes. The description is always a reduction. You choose words, and the words you have access to right now, before the thing exists, before you've learned what it actually is through the process of making it, are the words of the current version of you, which is not the version of you that will finish it. The description lands in the other person's mind, and they build a model from it. The model is smaller than what the thing could become, because models built from early descriptions are always smaller than things built from sustained work. And now their model exists alongside your vision, not neutrally, in competition with it. When the people around you have formed an early understanding of what you're working on, that understanding becomes a gravitational field. Every time you interact with them, every update you give, every question they ask, all of it pulls toward the version they understood. The version you described at the beginning, when you didn't know enough to describe it well. Their questions are about that version. Their suggestions are calibrated to that version. Their mental model of your goal is fixed at the resolution of your earliest, least informed description of it. This is how visions get domesticated. Not through opposition, but through premature comprehension. The work of any serious creative or entrepreneurial project involves discovering what the thing actually is, which is almost always different from what you thought it was at the beginning. This discovery process requires the freedom to let the thing become whatever it needs to become, unencumbered by early descriptions that other people are still holding. When people are holding those early descriptions, every evolution feels like an inconsistency. Every pivot requires justification. Every discovery that contradicts the original plan has to be explained to people who invested their understanding in the original plan. The thing stops being allowed to find its own shape. It gets pulled back toward the shape you described before you knew what shape it needed. There is a particular kind of creative death that happens in committee. Not because the committee is malicious, but because committees require shared understanding, and shared understanding requires stability. And stability is the enemy of the generative mess that produces original work. The best ideas are not committee-friendly in their early stages. They are strange, unformed, resistant to clean explanation. They need to be protected from comprehension until they're strong enough to survive it. This is why the most original thinkers, in any domain, tend to be secretive about work in progress. Not as a personality quirk, but as a functional necessity. They have learned, through experience or through instinct, that the early stages of anything genuinely new cannot survive the pressure of being understood by people who aren't inside the process. The outside perspective, which is usually offered as a gift, arrives as a constraint. What people understand about your goal also tends to anchor your own thinking in ways that are difficult to detect from the inside. When you've explained your approach to several people and received their reactions, those reactions become part of your internal landscape. The skeptical question someone asked in week 2 is still in your head in week 8, shaping how you interpret new information about whether the approach is working. The enthusiastic response someone gave to a particular aspect of the plan creates a subtle obligation to honor that aspect, even when the work itself is suggesting a different direction. You are no longer just responding to the work. You are responding to the accumulated reactions of everyone who heard the early description. The signal is contaminated, and you cannot fully separate your own judgment from the noise. I spent months on a project that had been described, briefly, in passing, to someone whose opinion I respected, as being about one specific thing. The description was accurate at the time, but the work evolved, and what it was actually about shifted into something more interesting and less easily categorized. I found myself resisting the evolution for weeks without knowing why. Eventually, I traced the resistance back to that early conversation. I had described it as X to someone smart, and they had engaged with X, and some part of my thinking was protecting X, rather than following the work where it needed to go. The description had become a cage I built myself and forgot was there. The practical consequence of this is that premature explanation doesn't just affect how other people see your work. It affects how you see it. Every time you translate something unfinished into language and offer it to another person, you are also crystallizing your own understanding of it at that stage of development. The translation becomes a commitment. The commitment slows the natural evolution of the idea. And the idea, which needed to keep moving to become what it was capable of becoming, hardens prematurely around a shape that was only ever a rough draft. The most alive ideas are the ones that haven't been explained yet. They are still in motion inside the person working on them, still capable of surprising their creator, still open to becoming something the creator didn't anticipate and couldn't have described at the start. Let them stay in motion. Resist the explanation. Give the thing room to become whatever it actually is rather than whatever you were able to say it was before you knew. The people around you will understand it eventually. When it's finished, when it's become what it needed to become without their comprehension weighing on the process, they will understand it better then anyway. Because you will have built the actual thing rather than the version you could describe before you knew how to build it. Understanding that arrives after completion is clarity. Understanding that arrives before completion is a ceiling. Keep the ceiling off until the building is done. Chapter 14. People who finish things look different while they're finishing them. The person in the middle of doing something real rarely looks like someone doing something real. This is one of the more disorienting truths about serious work, and it catches people unprepared in both directions. The person doing the work is unprepared for how unimpressive the process feels from the inside. The people observing are unprepared for how unremarkable the person looks while they're in it. Everyone has been trained, by highlight reels and origin stories told in retrospect, to expect that meaningful work announces itself while it's happening. It almost never does. The middle of anything significant looks, from the outside, like a person who hasn't figured things out yet. It looks like uncertainty, like slow movement, like someone who is maybe working on something, but maybe just thinking about working on something. It's hard to tell. It looks like the absence of the markers people associate with success. Confidence, momentum, clear forward progress, the general air of someone who knows where they're going. The markers are absent because they belong to a different stage. They belong to after. During is almost always quieter, messier, and considerably less telegenic than the version people imagine when they think about what it would look like to pursue something seriously. This gap between how serious work looks and how people expect serious work to look creates a specific social problem for anyone in the middle of it. The people around you are, consciously or not, reading signals about your trajectory. They are forming opinions about whether you are building something real or whether you are, as they have watched other people do, going through a phase. And the signals available to them during the actual building phase are not encouraging. You seem distracted. You are not as available as you used to be. When asked how it's going, your answers are honest, which means they are complicated and qualified and lacking the clean narrative arc that would be reassuring. You look, to the outside, like someone who is struggling. Because you are struggling. Struggling is what the middle of serious work feels like, and there is no version of it that looks effortless to observers who lack the context to understand what they're witnessing. The social pressure this creates is significant and underappreciated. People who care about you will express concern. People who don't know you well will form conclusions. The ambient social environment will consistently offer you the off-ramp, the gentle suggestion that maybe the pace is unsustainable, maybe the goal needs adjusting, maybe this particular thing isn't the right fit, and there's no shame in recognizing that. Every one of these interventions is calibrated to the appearance of the process rather than the reality of it. They are responses to what the work looks like, not to what the work is. And what the work looks like during the middle stage is almost always a poor representation of what the work actually is. This is the specific tax that visibility imposes on serious work. When people can see you working, they will interpret what they see through frameworks that were not built to understand the messy intermediate stages of genuine creative or entrepreneurial effort. Their interpretations will be well-meaning and systematically wrong, and if you've told them what you're working on, if they have a stake in understanding your journey, their well-meaning systematic wrongness will arrive in your life as advice, concern, and subtle pressure to either produce visible results or reconsider the enterprise. The people who finish things have learned to be comfortable being misread during the building phase. Not comfortable in the sense of unbothered. The misreading is genuinely isolating, and isolation has a cost. Comfortable in the sense of having made a prior decision that the misreading is acceptable, that the temporary appearance of someone who is lost is worth tolerating in exchange for the freedom to actually find the way without an audience providing directions. There is also an internal version of this problem that is harder to manage because you can't simply decide not to listen to yourself. During the middle of serious work, the internal experience frequently does not match the internal experience people imagine they would have if they were doing something significant. There is no sustained sense of purpose. There is no daily renewal of conviction. There are long stretches of mechanical effort, doubt about whether the approach is right, days that feel indistinguishable from spinning in place. People abandon real work during these periods, not because the work isn't working, but because the feeling of the work doesn't match their expectation of how meaningful pursuit should feel. They expected inspiration. They got tedium. They expected clarity. They got confusion. The gap between expectation and experience feels like evidence that something is wrong, when it is actually just evidence that they are in the middle. The middle always feels like the middle. That's how you know you're in it. What distinguishes the people who finish from the people who don't is not the absence of this experience, but the prior decision about what to do with it. The finishers have, somewhere along the way, updated their model of what serious work feels like during the process. They no longer expect the feeling to be a reliable indicator of whether the work is succeeding. They have separated the experience of the work from the quality of the work, which allows them to continue producing during the long stretches when the experience offers no encouragement. This separation is a skill, and it is built specifically through the experience of finishing things despite the feeling that the middle generates. Each completed project updates the model further. Each time you come through the messy middle and arrive at something real, you add to a body of evidence that the feeling was not the truth about the work. Over time, the evidence accumulates to the point where the middle feeling loses its power to stop you because you've been here before and you know what it precedes. The finisher's advantage is not talent or discipline in any abstract sense. It is a more accurate model of what the process actually feels like, built from the specific experience of having gone through it enough times to stop being fooled by the middle. The person in the middle of doing something real looks like they haven't figured things out yet because they haven't. That's what the middle is. Figuring out. The figuring out is the work. It is not a sign that the work isn't happening. It is the work happening, invisibly, in the only way real work ever happens. Without announcing itself, without looking impressive, without providing the external observer with anything useful to go on. From the outside, it looks like nothing. From the inside, if you've learned to read it correctly, it feels like exactly what it is. Progress, in the only form it actually comes in. Slow, quiet, and deeply unimpressive until it suddenly isn't. Chapter 15. When to finally speak. Silence is not the destination. It's the condition under which the destination gets built. This matters because silence misapplied becomes its own trap. The person who never shares, never discloses, never allows any work to become visible. This person is not practicing discipline. They are practicing avoidance with a philosophical justification. They are using the logic of strategic silence to protect themselves from the vulnerability of being seen, which is a different thing entirely and produces different outcomes. Permanent silence is not strength. It is fear wearing the costume of strategy. The goal was never silence. The goal was always the work. Silence is what protects the work during the stages when exposure would damage it. When those stages are over, when the work is complete enough, proven enough, real enough to withstand the pressure of other people's comprehension, the logic of silence no longer applies. Something else applies. And knowing the difference between the two is the final skill in this entire architecture. The question is not whether to speak. It is when and why, and to whom, and with what in hand when you do. The wrong reason to finally speak is the same reason most people speak too early. The need for validation. If you are sharing because you need someone to confirm that what you've been doing matters, the timing is wrong regardless of how much work you've done. The need for external confirmation is a signal that the internal engine hasn't fully engaged yet, that you are still, on some level, dependent on borrowed fuel. Speaking from that place produces the same dynamic as speaking at the beginning. The social reward arrives, the urgency softens, and the work loses something it needed to keep. The right reason to finally speak is function. You share when sharing serves a purpose that the work itself requires. When you need resources that require disclosure. When you need collaboration that requires context. When the work is ready to meet the world, and meeting the world is the next necessary step in its development. The test is simple and clarifying. If nothing would change about the work based on this conversation, the conversation is not yet necessary. There is also a readiness threshold that belongs to the work itself rather than to you. Some things are not ready to be shared, even when you are ready to share them. The work has its own maturity curve, and sharing before it reaches a certain point on that curve exposes it to criticism it cannot yet absorb, to comparison it cannot yet survive, to the pressure of other people's comprehension before it has developed the density to maintain its shape under that pressure. You feel this threshold when you reach it. There is a specific quality to finished work, or work that is finished enough, that is different from the quality of work in progress. It has settled. It no longer shifts significantly when you look at it from different angles. It can be described without losing something essential in the translation. The gap between what it is and what you say it is has narrowed to the point where the description is no longer a cage. When the work reaches that point, silence has served its purpose. Continuing to protect it from exposure is no longer protection, it is hoarding. And hoarded work, work that is never allowed to meet the world it was built for, fails in a different way than work that was shared too early. It fails privately, slowly, through the accumulation of reasons why the moment isn't quite right yet, until the moment has passed entirely, and the work exists only as a private record of something that could have been. The courage required to finally speak is different from the discipline required to stay silent. Staying silent is about resisting an impulse. Speaking, after a long period of private work, requires something more deliberate. The decision to make the work vulnerable after protecting it, to release control over the narrative after maintaining it, to allow other people's understanding of the thing to exist alongside your own. This is uncomfortable in a way that is easy to mistake for a signal to wait longer. It is not. It is just the specific discomfort of transition, of moving from one mode into another. The discomfort of emergence is not evidence that you're not ready. It is evidence that the transition is real. When you do finally speak, how you speak matters as much as when. The person who emerges from a long period of private work with results in hand is in a fundamentally different position than the person who announces intentions. You are not asking for belief. You are presenting evidence. The conversation is not about whether you can do this. It is about what you have done, which is a different conversation with a different register and different possibilities. This positioning is not arrogance. It is accuracy. You know things about the work that you couldn't have known at the beginning, about what it required, what it became, what it is capable of now that it exists. You can speak from that knowledge rather than from hope, which changes the quality of everything you say and everything others hear. The people worth speaking to when the work is ready will recognize the difference immediately. They will hear the specific gravity of someone who has been inside something long enough to know it. Not the enthusiasm of someone who just had an idea, not the performance of someone managing an image, but the particular authority that belongs only to people who stayed in the room until something real happened. That authority cannot be faked. It cannot be borrowed. It cannot be announced into existence. It accumulates in private, through all the work described in every chapter that preceded this one, and it arrives in your voice when you finally open your mouth after a long time of not opening it. Speak when the work is ready. Speak when sharing serves the work rather than your need to be seen. Speak when you have something in your hands rather than something in your head. And when you speak, say it plainly. The work did not need embellishment to become what it is. It does not need embellishment now. What you built in the silence is enough. It was always going to be enough. That was the point. You don't have to announce what you're building. That's it. That's the whole thing. Everything in this book has been an elaboration of that single idea. What it costs you when you do, what becomes possible when you don't, and why the people who seem to operate on a different level than everyone else are so often the ones who learned, earlier than most, to keep their mouths shut and their heads down and their work entirely to themselves until it was finished. The silence isn't absence. It's the sound of someone actually working. You will feel the pull to share. You will feel it today and tomorrow, and every time something shifts in the direction you've been hoping it would shift. The impulse is not weakness. It is human. What you do with it is the choice. The people who changed something in their own lives, in the lives of others, in the broader world, were not, as a category, the most vocal about their intentions. They were the most consistent about their actions, in private over time, without requiring the process to be witnessed in order to feel real. The work was real because they did it, not because anyone watched. You already know what you're building. You don't need anyone else to know yet. Let that be enough. Do the work. Stay quiet. Emerge with something that speaks for itself. The room will go still when you do. And in that stillness, you will hear something that no amount of prior encouragement could have given you. The specific, irreplaceable sound of results that nobody saw coming, landing in a world that wasn't ready for them. That sound is worth every day of silence it took to produce.